Jeopardy fans were auditioning in Boston this week. All of them one step...
Huh. Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. In the current pop culture landscape, there's a pretty well-known rule that Hollywood tends to follow. If you want to make a movie, you'd better have an IP. And while there are certainly exceptions to that rule, the vast majority of movies made nowadays are based on an existing IP or concept. I'm sure you've noticed the glut of sequels, reboots, remakes, biopics, and adaptations that have been gracing our screens recently. And despite what misinformed people on the internet would have you believe, it's not actually an underhanded way to extend copyright, although I can see why people think that. No, the simple truth of the matter is that movie executives think that if it isn't based on an already existing property, people won't care enough to see the movie and it won't make money. Superman will always have an audience. There will always be people interested in seeing a movie based on their favorite musician or artist. Less so when it's an entirely original story that no one has ever heard of. And while I personally disagree with that, I can't deny that it makes sense if you look at things from a solely capitalist perspective. Of course, it couldn't possibly be because movie tickets are really expensive and original TV shows frequently aren't given the chance to gain an audience before given the axe. But what does all this have to do with books? Well, movie adaptations are a pretty well-known phenomenon, and the general consensus is that they're always terrible. Except they're not. In fact, many well-known, wildly popular and successful films were adaptations of books. Don't believe me? We've already talked about a few on this show before. And that's why I'd like to welcome you all to Blockbuster Month. For the next 4 weeks, I will be taking a look at 4 novels that would later go on to inspire, or in the case of one of them developed concurrently with, I'll explain that when I get to that video, blockbuster films that are still remembered and beloved today. Starting with the book that inspired the film widely known as the first modern summer blockbuster. You know, the weather is a little warm here in New York, so I think it would be a good time for a swim. Unfortunately, I don't have a pool, and to be completely honest, I hate the beach, so we'll have to settle for reading about the water. Hence why our first journey into adaptation will be Peter Benchley's bestseller, Jaws. Jaws is a beloved film, not only because it's enjoyable and a technical marvel, but also because the screenplay is a great example of the traditional hero's journey. But that means that in order to fit that into the movie, they had to deviate pretty heavily from the book. Basically, what I'm going to do is, during the summary and review, do comparisons to the film to show how the story was adapted to suit the medium and how different they are, while also making note of where certain cuts either helped or harmed the film's story. The purpose of this month is not to pick a side and say whether the original work or the adaptation is better, but more so to show how the adaptation process works, and how even if it worked in the original novel, certain elements might not have translated so well to the screen. Oh, and I just want to make sure everyone knows that I've had this month on my list of theme month ideas for 2 years now, even before the Fudged Perspective, so I don't want to hear anything about me ripping off Linkara yet again, because for the first time, I had this idea first. Or, at the very least, it was parallel evolution, because I had the idea ages before he announced last month's theme, so Yeah, without any further ado, let's take the plunge into Jaws. The cover is, well, most of the covers are the same sort of deal, a shark and a swimmer, usually a naked woman like on the movie poster, though I will note that the original cover shark looks kinda goofy instead of scary. Probably because the teeth aren't being bared. Looks like he's saying, hi there, I'm gonna eat you, if that's okay. As opposed to the others where it's like, I'm a goddamn bleeping shark. The thing about Jaws is that the cover is really the easiest thing to get right, given that it's about a killer shark. So all you have to do is put a killer shark on the cover, and that automatically makes the cover awesome. Simple, but without being too busy. I like the sort of minimalism that it's just the shark, the woman, and the title. I like it, so let's get to the story itself. The movie had a fairly basic story, with really only one main plot, finding and killing the shark, and the subplot of Brody's fear of the water, which actually wasn't present anywhere in the original novel. The book, on the other hand, has several minor subplots that were not carried over in any way into the films. Like the movie, the book opens up with a girl going for a late-night, early-morning swim in Amity, Long Island, while her male companion remains on the beach. Predictably, she gets eaten by the shark, but since nobody saw that, Police Chief Martin Brody, played by Roy Scheider in the movie, is brought in to investigate the missing woman, retracing the steps until they discover her half-eaten body washed ashore. The coroner rules it a shark attack, and Brody, being a smart man, immediately plans to ensure that the public is notified. There's just one ripple in that plan. Amity is a poor tourist town, and they depend on the revenue gained during the summer to keep the town afloat in the winter, and causing any alarm, even for a single shark attack, could be catastrophic. The narration even mentions that Brody, in conjunction with Harry Meadows, editor of the local paper, had played down a series of pretty heinous crimes the previous summer because it might hurt the tourism. Meadows doesn't think that he should worry, since shark attacks are frequently one-offs, and it'll probably never happen again, famous last words, which only serves to strengthen Brody's resolve to warn the public. But Meadows' higher-ups, the owners of the paper, have already decided that there's not going to be a shark story. Although they won't be laughing when the Sharknado shows up and destroys the town, though. Brody, however, decides that he will at least temporarily close the beaches, just in case. After he tells Meadows of his decision, Brody is confronted by Mayor Larry Vaughn, Murray Hamilton in the movie, who isn't happy with the beach closing idea because of the aforementioned summer tourism, and because of his unnamed partners putting pressure on him. The darker side of polyamory. Larry tells Brody that if he closes the beaches, the selectmen of the town will vote to remove Brody from his position, and Brody reluctantly goes along with Larry's orders, since otherwise he'll lose his job and be unable to protect the town. Brody goes home and talks with his wife Ellen, a former wealthy summer resident, who married Brody, a middle-class year-round resident, who agrees with Larry's reasoning when Brody explains the discussion new word to Brody's chagrin. The following day, there are two more shark attacks, a little boy and an old man who were both caught by the shark. While swimming, it didn't just show up on land. That doesn't happen until the sequel. Meadows prints a story about it, since this attack had witnesses, and reveals to the public that Brody knew about the first shark attack, and tells the people of Amity that Brody himself made the decision to keep the beaches open, despite that being complete bullshit and Brody being adamant about closing them, causing the boy's mother to confront Brody and ask why he didn't close the beaches and let her son die, which really affects Brody. Following the second attack, the town calls in Matt Hooper, played by Richard Dreyfuss in the movie, a shark biologist who just so happens to be the younger brother of a man that Ellen dated before she met Brody. This leads into a subplot that is totally tangential and ends up being a non-issue since Hooper ends up like Ian Malcolm when this is through, where Ellen has a short affair with Hooper behind Brody's back because she's an unsatisfied housewife, and Hooper represents what could have been. Back to the main story, a sailor named Quint, Robert Shaw, who owns a tourist fishing boat, is also keeping a close eye on the shark attacks in Amity as they happen. Brody sends out a fisherman to patrol the waters for the shark, but he vanishes under mysterious circumstances attributed to the shark as well. Soon after, Larry forces the beaches to be opened, but not for altruistic town-saving reasons. He's in debt to the mafia, and without the summer, his partners won't get a return on their investment. And when his partners don't get a return on their investment, someone's gonna end up with broken legs. I kid, but they actually send Brody a message by killing his son's cat in front of the kid while Brody is out. Brody expresses his displeasure and is allowed to patrol the beaches to ensure safety. During a patrol, a teenager has a close call with the shark while Brody tries to keep nosy, shark-craving tourists and reporters away, and Brody ends up enlisting Quint's services to hunt the shark down, with Hooper accompanying them on their patrol. They spend a few days at each other's throats because of Quint's asshole behavior and Brody's feeling that Hooper did something with Ellen, but not being able to prove it. Hooper brings a cage on board so he can get pictures of the shark, and when they locate it one day, the shark busts through the cage and eats Hooper while he's inside. See? Told you that affair was a total non-issue. Ellen is also visited by Larry, who tells her that he and his wife are skipping town as a result of his mafia troubles. The next day, Brody and Quint go out and have their final confrontation with the shark, which is an intense affair, with Quint being eaten and Brody barely managing to take the apex predator down, with it dying from its many harpoon wounds before the local police chief sets off back for the shores of Amity. The first and most glaring change that was made when adapting the work, which is obvious if you've seen the movie, is that all of the subplots, apart from the stuff involving the shark, was cut, which I believe was a wise decision. The subplots were interesting. Ellen's affair has promise, and given that Benchley spent large swaths of the book giving Ellen's backstory and her former life as a rich summer person to justify it, and we get a lot of backstory for Larry's mob ties, but they never really go anywhere, because Hooper dies and Larry leaves at the end heading to parts unknown. We don't get real closure, and with movies you have a time limit and are forced to make the most of the available time. So extraneous plots, however interesting, gotta go. The only really satisfying ending we get is for the shark plot, so it makes sense that that was the only plot kept entirely intact. Most of the scenes with the shark are actually pulled straight off the page, with little deviation apart from changes influenced by the various changes to the main plot. The movie's ending, which is essentially the same with the shark being killed and roll credits, was satisfying because it was the only thread that we really needed resolution for. There were also some additions, like Brody's fear of water, which gave him extra obstacles in the water-based antagonist, reinforcing the hero's journey by having him need to overcome the fear to succeed, and a few other scenes, including Quint's recounting of the USS Indianapolis, which really nailed home the Ahab vibe they were going for with Quint's obsession with the shark. The final change, at least that I noticed, was, of course, that Hooper survived in the movie. I don't know why that changed, and the movie goes about it where Hooper is underwater for the entirety of the final confrontation, so Brody believes that he's all alone against Jaws, and it remains unchanged from the book's version, but I'm happy they did. I liked Hooper, and similar to Jurassic Park's Ian Malcolm, he was given a chance to survive in another medium. Although he shockingly never showed up in any of the Jaws sequels. Then again, given Jurassic Park's track record and the fact that none of the Jaws sequels were really all that good, that's probably a good thing. However, on the whole, anything involving the shark, save for Quint's choice of bait, and an action-packed climax where Brody actively kills the shark instead of it just dying mid-fight, the rest of the movie is really faithful. I bring all this up because people like to say that the reason that book adaptations so often come out bad is because the movie doesn't 100% adhere to the source material. We want a mini-series where you go over every chapter of the book in detail. But in some ways, that's a dangerous mindset, because as I've shown, the changes made are ultimately to ensure that the story makes sense in the adaptation's medium. And while sometimes the filmmakers fail, in this case and many others, they did really good. The characters in this book are extremely well written. Brody is likable and from the start shown to be thinking only of public safety, sometimes to the detriment of his wife and family. I found myself really invested in his story throughout the book and felt his rage, disappointment, fear, suspicion, everything. Benchley was able to get super emotive with Brody, and it made the story in the book feel all the more real. despite shark attacks like the ones depicted in the book being more fantasy than reality. Ellen is also written decently, and it's admittedly hard to feel bad for her given that she doesn't have any real reasons to want to cheat on Brody outside of vanity. Hooper is also written well, although he comes off as more of a snobby jerk than he did in the film, and this version was actually invited to dinner. Given that his brother had dated Ellen, it makes sense that he'd harbor some feelings for her, and Ellen was in a place to act on them, so I don't really blame him for aiding in the cheating. Since Ellen was the instigator, then he ended up dying anyway. And I can see why he was killed in the book, since he's a loose end who really had nothing else to contribute, but I'm happy that he survived in the film because he was much nicer there. Larry is a lot more likable here than he is in the movie, since in the movie his reasoning is pure greed and political favor, while here it's more of a concern for his own life and his wife's life, since they'd be threatened by the mafia if they didn't get what they wanted. I was still angry with him, but at the very least he was motivated by selfless reasons, since he's pretty clear that his wife's well-being is his major impetus, and given what we saw with Brody's cat, those mobsters are not above hurting others to get back at their target. I also like that we're given backstories for the side characters like Meadows and Quint that we didn't really get in the film. We don't get much more from Quint apart from expanding on what exactly he does in his boat, but it was welcome either way. Meadows was also interesting, his character showing how information spreads in Amity, and it really helped flesh out the town and made Amity feel more realistic. My one concern when I picked up the book was that given the level of suspense in the film, that the book couldn't live up to it, and it kind of didn't, but not to its detriment. The suspense in the book came from Brody and his concerns about safety, Ellen and Hooper and Amity, as opposed to just the threat of the shark. The shark parts were still good, but they were by far the minority of the book. The novel is just a character piece as opposed to a thriller like the movie. And that's not a bad thing. Like I said before, movies and books are different and require different things to be successful, as we'll see more of throughout the month. And the book is just as good, just in different ways. We really get to go inside Brody's head and learn his innermost thoughts, and I was on the edge of my seat as they inched ever closer to that final confrontation. Makes the man versus monster aspect a lot more powerful too, since we also, a few times, get to go into the shark's head. There's not much going on in there, but it's still fascinating. Admittedly, the fact that the shark just died instead of being actively killed was a bit of a letdown, but I can let it slide because it was still enjoyable. And there's just enough death that it doesn't feel gratuitous, but it also ensures that the reader understands the threat that the shark displays, especially with the copious amounts of times that the shark destroys things by simply swimming into them. The pacing was extremely well done, and I never felt bored once while reading, although there were times I had to put the book down because I was so enraged with the bureaucratic inaction of Amity in the face of the threat. Jaws is a phenomenal book, and entirely worthy of the New York Times review that said it was powerful. And it makes sense that a book this good would inspire such a brilliant film. Like Jurassic Park, Jaws has the distinction of having two equally amazing stories told between the source material and the adaptation, and several lackluster sequels, and I thoroughly enjoyed the novel. Not quite as much as the movie, but that's because I had seen the film first, so my first exposure and my nostalgia aligns with the film more than the novel. I can definitely see how it attracted big names like Spielberg and Robert Shaw, though, because it was rife with cinematic potential. I highly recommend this book, doubly so if you're a fan of the movie, because the differences are really interesting to take note of. And if you weren't a fan of the movie because the horror elements scarred you for life and ironically gave you a fear of water, you should definitely check the book out because it lets you experience the story without the primal fear being instilled, since you'll probably be more horrified by the actions, and sometimes inactions, of the humans in the story, as opposed to the shark. Next week, Blockbuster Month continues, as we'll be taking a look at a somewhat lighter novel that tells the story of a simple man and his run-ins with major historical events of the mid to late 20th century. And that's all I have to say about that. See you next time. fucking cool. I'm gonna put that at the beginning of the next video. I feel like my next video is gonna be the fucking Jaws video. Shit. That is absolutely going at the start of the video. I don't care. I don't care if it has no relevance. That's awesome. Oh my god, I'm fucking everywhere in that video.